good evening, depending on where you're watching our seminar from. Thank you for being with us today. I am Caterina Marinetti and I work as Scientific Project Manager for the NEWAVE Innovative Training Network. Today is the second appointment of the thematic seminar series as part of the NEWAVE Diffused conference, which started at the beginning of April and will be accompanying us until the end of the year with bi-weekly online webinars. The thematic seminars feature the NEWAVE early stage researchers that will guide us through the key water governance aspects that they have been investigating during the NEWAVE project. Today's seminar will start with Radhika Singh's lecture on scaling rainwater harvesting systems. And together with Radhika Singh, we welcome as invited discussant, Dr. Gianpaolo Dell'Angelo, who is the NEWAVE principal investigator. I want to kindly remind you that you can submit your questions anytime during the seminar using the Q&A function. And I will now invite Dr. Gianpaolo Dell'Angelo to introduce our speaker. Thank you so much and enjoy the seminar.
Thank you, Caterina. Hi, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be able to introduce Radhika Singh. She is an early stage researcher of the NEWAVE network, working on her conclusion of her PhD at the University of Nairobi, very soon to be defended. The thesis has been submitted already. And I was very fortunate to be able to work with Radhika closely on a publication that was recently published in EIST, one of the leading journals in sustainability transitions theories. And Radhika is a brilliant scholar working on mainly improving water security in fragile and conflict-affected settings. She's now working also as a consultant for the IWMI, the International Water Management Institute, and she carried research in Sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, and Southeast Asia on various water and climate-related challenges. And despite her scholarly young status, she already published a very interesting book called Along the Betwa, a river walk through the drought-prone region of Bundelkhand in India. And keep an eye on her future publications, which are gonna be, which are in the pipeline right now. So without further ado, Radhika, I would like to invite you on our virtual stage.
Thank you so much, Gianpaolo. Thanks so much, Caterina. So yeah, I'll jump right into the presentation. Gianpaolo already introduced a little bit about me, my background, what I work on. But yeah, I've been based in Nairobi for the last, I guess, almost 4 years now. And I've been working on a PhD at the University of Nairobi. And yeah, specifically looking at the topic of rainwater harvesting systems for irrigation, and more specifically, how these sorts of systems can be scaled within countries, particularly of Sub-Saharan Africa and East Africa. I'll go over now the table of contents. So in this presentation, I will first go over a background to my work, the sort of literature review that I've conducted and the methodology that I used. Then I'll discuss some of the findings, including the analytical frameworks that I developed, and some of the results that we found after applying the analytical framework to the case study of rainwater harvesting. The discussion following the main research questions basically encompasses 4 topics, including how policy and legal approaches deprioritize small-scale irrigation development in Kenya, how donor-led approaches do not always engender sustained adoption of irrigation technologies, how agroclimatic conditions give rise to new markets and livelihood opportunities, and finally, how socioeconomic and cultural dynamics shape attitudes towards the adoption of rainwater harvesting systems. Then I'll also try to conclude with some recommendations for national level and county level policy and governance. So what I've really tried to do in this topic is take a wide-ranging approach and try to understand the topic of rainwater harvesting from many different angles. I think that the approach that we've taken, which is specifically to apply certain analytical frameworks, such as the framework of technological innovation systems and sustainability transitions, to really understand the dynamics that go into the adoption of such rainwater harvesting systems. So as a brief introduction to the case study and to the context of Kenya, I think many of us are aware of some of the issues that smallholder farmers in Kenya have to deal with. In particular, given that over 80% of Kenya is either semi-arid or arid lands, there's a real lack of water resources in certain areas, and therefore a lack of access to irrigation for a lot of smallholder farmers. This presents serious limitations to livelihoods that depend on agricultural production. Even a lot of the pastoralist communities that live in these areas practice agriculture seasonally or as a supplementary form of income. Historically, we've seen that the expansion of irrigation in Kenya has taken place through more formal and state-led initiatives, such as, say, building more dams or canals. It can also take place through more informal mechanisms, for example, with communities or households leading initiatives where water is drawn from rivers, streams, lakes, or other nearby water bodies. But there are certain problems with these two approaches. Further expanding irrigation in these ways may contribute to unsustainable water resource abstraction, and it can also be very difficult for communities that are located further away from water bodies to be able to access water. So the intensification of this form of irrigation expansion, either through formal or informal means, does have its limitations in arid areas. It's in this context that rainwater harvesting for irrigation emerges as a viable solution. So what rainwater harvesting in this context really means is when farmers collect water runoff after rainfall and store water in some sort of, it can be a tank, it can be a water pan, it can be a pond. And this water may last up to several months, depending on what sort of water system is being designed and used, and also what the levels of rainfall have been. Not only can rainwater harvesting help farmers ensure more stable crop production, it can also allow them to grow higher value crops, such as vegetables that take just a few months to reach maturity and can be harvested in multiple seasons over the year. Rainwater harvesting has also been argued to enhance resilience to climate change. As weather patterns become more irregular, storing and collecting rainwater when it's available is an important coping and adaptation strategy for many different types of livelihoods. This leads us to our problem statement. Given that 70 to 80% of Kenyans draw some amount of income from agricultural production, but less than 10% of agricultural production is irrigated, there's really a serious need to improve access to irrigation to boost livelihood opportunities as well as overall economic development. However, as I mentioned, expanding these traditional forms of irrigation, think of dams, canals, where water is drawn directly from surface water sources, can actually exacerbate water insecurity. Climate change presents an additional challenge to ensuring water security in these areas. So it is in this context that governments and development agencies have tried to increase adoption and the uptake of rainwater harvesting systems in Kenya, both at the household and also community level. However, study after study shows that these initiatives that try to promote sustained adoption have had limited effect, and that sustained adoption is rare. Systems are often abandoned after a short period of time. And this is not just the case of rainwater harvesting initiatives in Kenya, it's the case for rainwater initiatives across sub-Saharan Africa. So understanding the sort of enabling environment that is needed for rainwater harvesting systems to actually be scaled sustainably is really important for developing appropriate policy and legislation for scaling rainwater harvesting systems. Now I'll just go over some of the research questions that I focused on. My overarching one was, how can irrigation policy and governance support the creation of an enabling environment for the scaling of rainwater harvesting systems for irrigation in Kenya? I'll go into a little bit more of why I've chosen to concentrate specifically on irrigation policy and governance. For example, rainwater harvesting is included in climate adaptation plans. It's also included in agricultural plans. However, I'm going to try to argue that it is in the policy and legislation surrounding irrigation that the potential for rainwater harvesting systems to scale really needs to be tapped. So 4 of the sub-questions include, Number one, how have policy frameworks at the national and county levels influenced the scaling of rainwater harvesting systems? Two, how have donor-led approaches to promote rainwater harvesting adoption shaped adoption dynamics and the likelihood of scaling in the long term? Three, how have agroclimatic conditions affected the development of market linkages and value chains around rainwater harvesting technologies, and to what effect? And finally, how have socioeconomic dynamics and cultural institutions influenced perceptions of rainwater harvesting systems and the costs and benefits of adoption? The literature review that I conducted to try to create a grounding for answering these 4 questions encompassed analysis of policy documents, organizational reports from small local level NGOs all the way to large international NGOs and multilateral institutions, looked at academic articles, conference reports, theses, and dissertations. This literature review really helped frame the 4 questions to identify some of the main gaps in research and to also then guide the methodology that I would use, data collection and data analysis. What I found in the literature review is that it became very clear that most research on rainwater harvesting has been limited to the techno-managerial or the socioeconomic or project-based issues of rainwater harvesting systems. When techno-managerial, we can think of, for example, oh, what's the circumference of the pond? Will it be able to collect enough water? Socioeconomic studies often try to link socioeconomic indicators to likelihood of adoption. So for example, we see, oh, households with a higher level of education are more likely to adopt rainwater harvesting system. And then the project-based research is mainly focused on the design of the interventions and initiatives, so looks at more organizational capacity, organizational timeframes. So all of this really pointed to a major gap in research on the type of larger enabling environment that was needed to scale rainwater harvesting systems, including the wider cultural, political, and economic factors that need to be present. Together, I'm going to show in my research that understanding all of these factors help put in place a picture of the innovation systems surrounding rainwater harvesting systems and the effect that they play on people adopting rainwater harvesting systems for irrigation. Understanding all of these factors has several implications for improved policy and governance aimed at the scaling of rainwater harvesting systems. The methodology that I chose to use was largely a qualitative approach. This allowed for a really rich contextual understanding of the subject matter. The data sources that I touched on, including in the literature review, were diverse, and they included, of course, policy documents, academic literature, but then also long semi-structured and unstructured interviews, reports from other sorts of organizations involved in rainwater harvesting systems, focus group discussions, all of which help provide a more comprehensive view of the rainwater harvesting landscape. In addition to the comparative case study method, I also used process tracing to understand the timeline behind different patterns of adoption of rainwater harvesting systems across the country and try to understand the main causal links and reasons behind different levels of adoption. The study sites that I chose were 2 sites in Kenya, Laikipia Plateau and the Yatta Plateau. The geographic and climatic conditions of these sites make them particularly suitable for studying rainwater harvesting. And the sites were also chosen based on their long history of rainwater harvesting interventions, the availability of extensive historical and other data on these sites, and also their relevance to policy considerations. In general, I focused on one particular type of rainwater harvesting systems because that sort of system has been shown to have the most potential to provide farmers with supplemental water that they need to grow certain types of crops. And so this study focuses on ex situ mesocatchment rainwater harvesting systems in the form of household level farm ponds. These farm ponds collect rainwater runoff from nearby roads or paths after rainfall. So I'll first talk about one of the main analytical systems that I used, the technological innovation systems concept. So what I really liked about GIS is that it allows for a systems approach to understanding technology adoption and scaling. It looks not just at the technology itself, but also the various actors, institutions, infrastructure, and processes that surround and support the technology. What TIS really focuses on are the interactions, the learnings between different actors, and the sort of multi-directional flows of knowledge that are necessary for a technology to scale. It really subverts the typical pathways of adoption that we've seen over the last couple of decades, where you have a much more linear projected pathway from developing an innovation to people eventually adopting the innovation. What TIS shows is that adoption is just not as linear as that. You really need to take account all of these different actors, institutions, etc., take into account their interactions, and then how they impact the system as a whole. TIS is made up of these structural elements, which I've put into the middle of the circle and mentioned, as well as the functions of the technological innovation itself. That's from F1 to F7. They encompass entrepreneurial activities, knowledge development, knowledge diffusion, guidance of the search, market formation, resource mobilization, and the creation of legitimacy. What this tries to say is that once you have the structural elements in place with strong enough capacity and quality, so for example, the actors have the resources, the information, the knowledge that they need, and they will be best able to fulfill these different functions that are part of an innovation system. When all of these functions are fulfilled, the technology has a much higher chance of scaling. So what I've tried to do is look at these different functions and these different structural elements in the context of Kenya, try to understand where those gaps are and what could be filled moving ahead. I've also incorporated insights from other analytical frameworks that seemed necessary for trying to understand how adoption and scaling dynamics were taking place. So first, sustainability transitions. Sustainability transitions is a concept that demonstrates the process by which rainwater harvesting innovation systems moved from more protective niche spaces into mainstream agri-food regimes. What sustainability transitions theory does is help explain long-term adoption dynamics of an innovation and also how that could lead to more systemic transformations. Then I've also used the livelihoods perspective, which I've complemented with insights from sustainability transitions and TIS. The livelihoods perspective was really important because it focuses in on the individuals and households that are ultimately the users and the final adopters of innovations. This is something that I will argue that both the sustainability transitions theory and the technological innovation systems doesn't pay as much attention to as needed. So in short, the TIS lens shows that rainwater harvesting for irrigation requires the development of innovation systems around different technologies that are part of rainwater harvesting. The sustainability transitions theory demonstrate the process by which the innovation systems move from protected niche spaces into mainstream agri-food regimes. And finally, the livelihood perspective illustrates how changes in livelihood opportunities can influence the adoption of innovations. So I've used all of these analytical frameworks and their insights to shed more light on how policy and governance can better support an enabling environment for scaling rainwater harvesting systems. I'd also just like to include over here an article that we had written with was me, Jempel, and two of my supervisors. And what we tried to do was really hone into the role of livelihoods in agri-food sustainability transitions using rainwater harvesting systems as a case study to try to understand this concept a little bit better. We've tried to argue that since sustainability transitions theory was developed in the global north, where livelihoods are generally a little bit more stable and provided with a lot more security than in the global south, they often don't pay as much attention to livelihoods as they need to. And so I've tried to, or we've tried to argue that in this article that there needs to be a greater appreciation of livelihoods when trying to understand adoption dynamics in the global south. I won't go into this too much. There's a lot of information on this slide, but I'm also happy to discuss it further with anyone else who might be interested. But this is the framework that really tries to combine insights from the three analytical frameworks. The sustainable transitions, sustainability transitions, technological innovation systems, and the livelihoods perspective. So once I developed this analytical framework, now it was time to really understand how then to map it onto the case study and try to understand what it was telling us about possible interventions in policy and governance. So just to give a brief overview for those who have very little familiarity with this case study, I map out the major developments of relevance to rainwater harvesting scaling in the two sites in Kenya, in Yatta and Laikipia. I hone in on water availability, land use changes, migration, cultural tendencies, horticultural industry development, livelihood opportunities, and risk perceptions. So I've really, again, tried to identify factors in the wider cultural, economic, and political dynamics in this area to understand what was essential for the growth of an enabling environment around rainwater harvesting. I then divided for ease of understanding to three different phases of adoption. So phase one is when experimentation around rainwater harvesting technologies and its uses takes place, and the innovation systems around rainwater harvesting for irrigation begins to form. This sort of experimentation took place in both case study sites, Laikipia and Yatta, mainly driven by NGOs and also governments due to the prevailing water insecurity that we've seen in those areas. Phase two is when the innovation system around rainwater harvesting grows, markets begin to take shape, and technology-specific institutions emerge. This is when the rainwater harvesting system breaks out of its protected space in the niche and then establishes a foothold in mainstream markets. Phase three is when path dependence drives further innovation system functional development, moving into the maturity phase. This innovation system is able to mature and successfully reconfigure the mainstream system dynamics and the dominant livelihood strategies. I would argue that while Yatta has not been able to reach phase two, Laikipia, one of the study sites, has been able to, and now is being adopted by, and rainwater harvesting is being adopted by small-scale farmers across the region, really shaping the larger agricultural industries and export industries in those areas. Then I'll go now just quickly talk about some of the factors limiting the creation of enabling environments for rainwater harvesting for irrigation systems. What I found is that, one, national level policy frameworks tend to prioritize larger scale irrigation development, which marginalizes development around smaller, decentralized, and more informal irrigation systems and technologies. Since rainwater harvesting systems are so often carried out on the household scale, on a very small scale, and in very, very informal ways, the state often just does not recognize these as legitimate irrigation systems and therefore does not provide support for these irrigation systems. Most of the development narratives in Kenya are still very much targeting larger scale industrialized commercial agriculture, think big dam development, and this really sidelines the potential for smaller scale irrigation development such as rainwater harvesting. Second, I think one of the main findings has been that the success of donor-led initiatives is really limited by organizational factors such as donor requirements, funding restrictions, short-term projects, and the continued dominance of the technology transfer approach. So donor initiatives are often just 2 or 3 years. As anyone who's working or who has worked in the development space knows, it's extremely difficult to be able to sustain development initiatives or development projects without the continued funding that the organization provides. So once this organization ends the project and withdraws funding, these projects almost rarely are sustained. Even linking them to, say, government extension officers often does not produce very many results. And also the technology transfer approach is something that I wanted to emphasize as being especially problematic in the field of irrigation and the larger field of agriculture, where organizations have a couple of different technologies. Say, for example, now solar pumps are the new thing. And they would simply try to give farmers those equipments and those technologies, help them use them for the given time period, but then once there's any problem with the technology, for example, a part gets broken and then there are no more spare parts, or something clogs up and there isn't enough knowledge or capacity to know how to fix it, the technology is just abandoned. And so that's what we see a lot with donor-led initiatives. Third, the presence of specific agroclimatic conditions are super important in knowing whether agriculture industries will develop and whether the input and output market linkages and value chains will form. These are essential for GIS development. So if we're in an area where these industries haven't really developed, there's really very little of them, there's really very little potential of them to develop. We see that the technologies used in rainwater harvesting systems are often much more expensive to get by. There's much more, there's a much less diversity to choose from, and they often take a lot longer to arrive. So that's why having an existing industry related to agriculture or related to horticulture that can provide these input and output market linkages are extremely important. And finally, we see that the attitudes of risk aversion really tend to lower adoption and innovation system formation until we see clear and sustained evidence of benefits by the community. Gender dynamics and traditional livelihoods also influence these risk perceptions. Gender, I think, is a really interesting consideration with rainwater harvesting systems because on one hand, when it comes to commercial production of crops, male farmers are often the ones that are driving the adoption of rainwater harvesting systems. However, when it comes to rainwater harvesting for more sustenance production, such as growing maize or beans, you find that women are more often involved. Since women and men typically have different levels of control of the household finances and of financial decision-making, this leads to different results when it comes to adoption. I think that the lack of comprehensive and deliberate focus on rainwater harvesting, adoption, and scaling in both the national level policy frameworks as well as the county level policies really limits the creation of an enabling environment. In general, the government does not provide enough specific guidance and support for rainwater harvesting to the different stakeholders, including NGOs. Due to this, there's really a lack of specific targeting for beneficiaries who could feasibly adopt rainwater harvesting. I'm just coming to the end now. I'll be talking about some of the conclusions and recommendations specifically for policy in Kenya. So I think it's very clear that policy and governance frameworks can better support the creation of an enabling environment by incorporating insights from these different theories and analytical frameworks that we've used. There are several national level strategies and policies that providing overarching frameworks to build upon. So for example, the bottom-up economic transformation agenda in particularly can be leveraged to facilitate rainwater harvesting development. Reforms in water policy and governance are also important to help clarify roles and responsibilities of the different government levels and the different departments that can help in supporting the scaling of rainwater harvesting systems. At the county level, in Kitui, Machakos, and Laikipia, where the two case study sites were based in, rainwater harvesting development is primarily aimed at climate change adaptation, at delivering technological inputs, and then at training. However, there's a need to move beyond this kind of input distribution to actually supporting the creation and the sustaining of a vibrant innovation system around rainwater harvesting technologies. County governments could also include mechanisms and funding in their development plans to target communities that are likely to adopt rainwater harvesting systems. They could also incentivize private sector and community-based organizations, and also facilitate more collaboration amongst the different stakeholders that are involved. Finally, counties could also provide specific guidance for donor-led initiatives supporting rainwater harvesting systems. There is a real need for better coordination between NGOs, CBOs, governments, and the private sector, and for outlining provisions related to the private sector involvement and how market linkages could be further strengthened. So yeah, I hope that this helps give an overview of some of the things that I've focused on, some of the key findings, the analytical frameworks that I've used. And yeah, it's a lot of information to pack into 30 minutes. And sometimes it feels like I have, yeah, it's hard to, after being so steeped in this research for so long, to come out of it and know whether anything you're saying is comprehensive at all to outsiders. So I hope that this was at least a little bit interesting and informative. And yeah, maybe over to Katerina and Jean-Paul. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Radhika, for this very informative presentation. It's very nice to go through your academic and research journey and see the findings from your research. I will now invite Jean-Paul to provide his discussion to your lecture. Thank you so much. And I will also remember to, Jean-Paul, I will just give a reminder to the participants to please submit your questions in the Q&A. I've seen that some questions are already coming, but please do not be shy. Thanks.
Thank you, Katerina, and thank you, Radhika. I might be a little bit biased as a discussant, honestly, because you know how much I like your work, and I think that your contribution is innovative in many different ways. And what I think is particularly fascinating, in my opinion, is that it brings together spaces that are completely disconnected. So a first level, and excuse my abstraction here, it's at the conceptual level. I think that what you are doing with your work, it's it's clearly visible in your environmental innovation societal transition paper that I posted in the chat. At the conceptual level, what you're doing, that I think it's very important, and it's something that was also recognized by the editors of a journal that is particularly really particularly selective, is this idea of bringing a global South perspective within the sustainability transition framework, within the sustainability transitions literature, which has been very much dominated by, let's say, a global North perspective. And I think that with the global South perspective, of course, it's not just bringing in a perspective from lower income countries and expertise and problematics from there, but it's also bringing different type of epistemologies, different types of priorities. So perhaps a first point that I would like to hear from you, rather than go on about, is how, in your experience and through your research, let's say you are able to bring together these different theoretical spaces, and what is the advantage of it, and why should a global South perspectives actually care about sustainability transitions literature, if that is it's a type of thinking that actually was born and developed around a very specific type of sustainability problems that are characterized by certain geographical, economical, and political conditions. I think that also this a little bit more broadly could lead to a reflection about what sustainability means, and what does it also mean to have this kind of like dichotomy between the global South and the global North. Are there really like different perspectives and different types of expertises there that should be accounted for? The background thinking that I have here is very much questioning the entire notion of development. So we can open up, and I invite you to share your thoughts as broad as you wish. But a lot of what we are hearing here, it's also this idea of transference of technical knowledge, the idea of fundamentally other types of global north, global south cooperation, but where there is a clear determination of what is the direction and who set the direction and what is good and what is bad. But perhaps the rainwater harvesting might be a little bit different in that sense. And I'm also thinking about the fact that what is interesting with the type of technologies, and this is also something interesting that you do here, you're combining conceptual and academic theorization with something that is extremely concrete, that happens on the ground, that has clear implications for livelihoods, another concept that you really elaborate in your work. But what I'm thinking that is interesting specifically with this technology, and I'm thinking about the work of Schumacher, of the size of the intervention. So we are looking at interventions that are actually small scale and have perhaps the possibility to empower communities and livelihoods at the local scale. And I'm not surprised that when you are reviewing the policy implications, then what you see is that from a state governance point of view, there continues to be, despite years of research, for example, in the Ostromian field, starting from Elinor Ostrom on small-scale irrigation schemes, there continues to be this idea that in order to manage resources in a more rational way, you need to have a bigger type of interventions with higher levels of technology and investment. And perhaps the last thought, and then I will pass it to you, is we are also coming out of a shared experience at the UN Water Conference. We know that there is an emerging agenda. It's tangible that there is some type of consensus creation around a global water agenda with different type of activities that are happening. And I think what we all saw there was this very strong emphasis on this very neoliberal recipe of increasing finances, increasing investments, increasing debt. What a surprise! Increasing technological and infrastructural development. So those are the continue to be the bullets of the neoliberal agenda, which now it's of course trying also to expand in the water domain. So these are my thoughts for now, and just want to give you perhaps some inspiration to elaborate further. And thanks a lot. Your presentation was also really clear and very informative. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gianpaolo. Yeah, that's certainly a lot of really interesting stuff to try to unpack, and I'll begin to I'll just try to go over some of the points that you made and share some of my thoughts about them in no particular order really, but maybe I'll just start with the larger sort of development discourses that we see in so many countries of the global south, which is very much this modernization narrative, the idea that there is some sort of catch-up game that needs to be played, in which big industries such as agriculture need to follow along certain paths that have been carried out in the global north. So in this context, it's big dams, canals, these sorts of major water resource development systems. What I think is interesting is to see in what areas these kinds of development discourses don't necessarily apply. So for example, in the manufacturing sector, we rarely see this kind of push that, countries in sub-Saharan Africa should invest in their manufacturing sector to go along the same development paths as countries of the global north, right? Like when you look at where the money is going in terms of donor funding, it's certainly not going towards manufacturing. So you can already see that there is a sense that In some areas, sure, that sort of Western style development needs to be encouraged, it needs to be pushed, and in other cases, it shouldn't be. And of course, this comes with all sorts of political economy, all sorts of political economy dynamics, historical dynamics, colonial dynamics. And so, for example, in Kenya and in many other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, we see that these irrigation schemes that are now being promoted by the World Bank are really continuations, or actually continuations of a lot of irrigation schemes that developed in the colonial area. And these schemes are, of course, massive, massive farms growing wheats or rice, goods basically that can easily be exported. And so you have these sort of economic dynamics already set in play for more than the last 100 years that continue into countries' development discourses, even post-independence. So this is something that we see in Kenya, for example. And what I was really interested in trying to do in this PhD and more generally in my work is to really try to understand, well, what are the alternative development pathways out there? If countries in the global south didn't go along these same development pathways as the global north, what would that mean? What are the implications of that? How can that be done? Is that good? Is that bad? Why not? And for me, this particular topic is super interesting for a number of reasons. One, it's that, as I had mentioned in this presentation, the vast majority of Kenyans draw some portion of their income from agriculture. So that's 70 to 80% of Kenyans draw some aspect of their income from agriculture, compared to in Western countries, it's what, 2%? I don't know. 2% of people employed in agriculture, maybe 10% of, or 2 to 10%, so it's a much smaller margin, it's a much smaller amount, and therefore has just very different implications for the sort of sustainable development that we're talking about moving forward. If Kenya is going to go down the super industrialized, commercialized way of agriculture, wouldn't that mean that now you'd have a huge proportion of people that no longer are able to draw some aspect of their livelihood from agriculture, from smallholder agriculture? Because what this large-scale agriculture really does is drive out the smallholder producers. It drives out those types of production that are just much more informal and are not as interesting to the state. So rainwater harvesting for me was interesting in that sense. How can we think of livelihoods, of sustainable livelihoods in agriculture for such a large proportion of Kenya's population? And then also when we think of water resource management, why can it not be more decentralized? What is the need to have these super centralized water resource extraction and distribution points? I mean, anyone who's read James Scott will know that so much of this has to do with legibility. It has to do with the state being able to control, like simply put, the more decentralized, the more informal, the more illegible it is, and the less the state is able to control those production activities. So there's a clear sort of I guess, impetus for the state to move towards formalization. But our role as researchers, our role as scholars is obviously always to understand what those implications are and try to understand if there are any alternatives to that sort of formalization. And I think that goes into a little bit on some of the differences that we see in the global north and in the global south and why these alternatives are so necessary. So what we often see when it comes to sustainability transitions discourse, and sustainability transitions, of course, is just this transition to a more sustainable society. So when we're thinking of green energy, when we're thinking of converting to carbon-free economies, that's, for example, a sort of sustainability transition. And sustainable development involves all of these sustainability transitions across the world in every single system that we could think of. Probably. But what happens in sustainability transitions discourse in the global north is that you almost see that it's sort of taken for granted that there are these social security measures, that there is this level of economic and political stability that can be taken for granted when we are embarking on these sustainability changes. On the other hand, you don't often see that in a lot of countries of the global south. In several countries, you see that governments are much more unstable, the political economic situation is much more dynamic, and because of this, livelihoods are in much more flux. So people, like, it's kind of like a running joke over here that, as soon as you come to Kenya, you will never have just one source of income, right? You'll have your main job, and then you'll have, 3 other side jobs, 3 other like side hustles, or whatever you want to call it. But that's because there is a need, since livelihoods are so unstable, to really diversify where you're getting your income from, where you're getting your stability from. Of course, governments are also not often able to afford the type of social security nets that you see in the global north. So even if someone loses their job, you wouldn't have that same security of collecting, say, unemployment benefits, being able to get cash vouchers and that sort of thing. So that's why, in response to these more dynamic contexts, people and households in the global south often have to constantly shift their livelihood strategy, right? So I hope that that's kind of clear what the difference is in the global north. Livelihoods are a little bit more stable in the global north. They have to be kind of constantly shifting to adjust to the more dynamic context. Now, it's important to preface all of this by saying that global north and global south are they're categories that are constructed for a useful analytical purpose, but it's very, very important that it's not generalized, right? Like, as we discussed with the editors in the article, when they were reading this particular section on differences, they had emphasized that, when you're looking at what's happening with Ukraine and when you're looking at what's happening with Russia or even Israel right now, it's not as clear and easy to say that this is how global north dynamics are, this is how global south dynamics are. But it is important to understand that in several cases, there are countries in the global south which do experience much more dynamic political and economic changes, and livelihoods have to be adjusted, and livelihoods are forced to adjust accordingly. So then when it comes to sustainability transitions, those livelihood shifts, those livelihood changes, those livelihood decisions need to be taken into account. Sustainability transitions often involves the adoption of some sort of innovation. So if we're talking at, it can be something as simple as, say, paper straws or whatever, instead of plastic straws, to adopting green energy, or to adopting a new type of irrigation system, for example, rainwater harvesting irrigation systems. A lot of these require the adoption of a technology, and understanding livelihoods is super important to understand why a certain technology is adopted, or innovation is adopted or not. Finally, I'll just want to end with touching upon the UN Water Conference. I mean, I think that it was just a really interesting, in some cases disheartening conference to be a part of. I think what we saw in a lot of cases was this push for more privatization, the neoliberal sort of agenda for water governance. But I think what was particularly, and remains a particularly interesting and important focus of study for me, is to understand the ways in which finance flows differently and the private sector acts differently in contexts in global south that I'm familiar with. So, for example, when we're talking about the role of the private sector in a lot of countries in the global south, we are talking about the private sector and often NGOs or development organizations taking on the role of the state in ways that you wouldn't see them doing in the global north. And so I think that a lot of the conversation around the role of the private sector in water governance needs to be seen in the context of what other institutions are out there and what other actors are out there. And if we don't want to go down the route of privatizing everything, what are other forms of governance, alternative forms of governance that we in the global south can come up with that doesn't necessarily have to converge with what's going on in the global north? And I think when we're talking about common resources, and we're talking about the governance of common resources, the areas in the global south are absolutely areas of inspiration when we're, really finding just incredible ways of governing sustainably resources in the long term. And, several ESRs have worked on topics related to this. I'm thinking of Donna in particular and her work on the commons. And I think that, yeah, I think there's a lot for us to learn about the role of finance, money, and the private sector, and how that feeds into alternative forms of sustainable development in the global south. I feel like I've said a lot, so I'll stop over here, hand it back over to Jampal, and I can also try to quickly answer any questions.
Thanks, Radhika. Before we pass it to Caterina to moderate some of the questions that we are receiving from our participants, perhaps just a quick reaction to your final comment. I was also thinking exactly along the same lines of the fact that there is not only this dynamic between and tension between state and the private sector. Luckily, there are communities, and there are other type of actors that can play a very strong role in environmental governance and in actually safeguarding common interests. In particular, I'm thinking also about the experience, my own research experience in Kenya. I was collaborating on a project that was actually started by Elinor Ostrom on community irrigation schemes, and what was quite clear out of that project is that actually the 2002 Kenya Water Act, and then I didn't follow the more recent policy developments, but the 2002 Kenya Water Act really, which was actually very much inspired by the work of Elinor Ostrom herself for certain dynamics, pushed a lot in the direction of subsidiarity and decentralization and creating more of a polycentric system. But I think what we should be careful about is that there is a narrative that looks at the emergence of new actors going beyond the state, which is then very often co-opted by the private sector. And so I think that is where there should be a little bit of clarity and positioning, political positioning. And I'm also thinking like a similar dichotomy and tension is around the issue of formalization. So it's either informal or formal, but then we know how formalizing of tenure and water titles and land titles then often leads to actually dispossession, because once there is a formalization, then the market takes over. But at the same time, we also need to be careful about recognizing that there is a space for legal safeguards. So the entire space of collective rights and community rights and rights of nature, all of that, it's also really interesting. But I think that your work really is providing a lot of clarity and also being able to see beyond these type of tensions, and I think it does give development experts also the possibility to not only theorize but also to perhaps implement programs in a positive, for however we define positive, in a positive way. So thanks a lot. I think there is I don't want to take more advantage of my discussant position here, and I will pass it to Caterina. I see there are many questions, so your presentation clearly raised a lot of interest.
Thank you so much, Jampal, and thank you also, Radhika, for your responses already. And as Jampal mentioned, we received many questions. Most of them is good to see that the audience has familiarity with the topic, and many of them are also working in the same country as you are. So that will be definitely a very interesting further discussion. I would like to start with the first question we received from a colleague, Giulio Castelli from University of Florence, who is also an expert on water harvesting. He's asking more about the different technologies that you have looked at. So the question is, if you were able to distinguish between different technologies and not just in general rainwater harvesting, and is explaining more that rainwater harvesting is a large number of technologies ranging from pits to flood harvesting. Some technologies are also traditional in the local context. For example, you have flood harvesting in Ethiopia, Yesur, and in Tunisia. And how does the presence of traditional water harvesting technologies influence scaling? That's the question. And he's also congratulating for the work, of course.
Thank you so much for the question. I think it's such an interesting question because we have, of course, so many instances around the world, in South Asia and in East Africa, where you have traditional forms of rainwater harvesting. So I really love this question. I mean, if I can just provide a quick example of my experience that I recently did in Ethiopia. So I was conducting research for the International Water Management Institute in a refugee hosting community in Ethiopia. And so it's a context in which the refugee population has increased, and also the host community population has really increased because they've been attracted to the humanitarian resources that organizations have been able to offer. So basically, in this border zone between Ethiopia and Somalia, you have a huge expansion of population and, of course, increased stress on water and water resources. Also in this region, you have the traditional form of water harvesting called birkads. What has been interesting to see is that even though you have this traditional form of water harvesting that has been practiced for hundreds of years, once there are all of these massive changes in this landscape, in this context, a lot of those ties and a lot of those institutions and practices that have gone into maintaining rainwater harvesting systems break down. So in this area now, we see abandoned birkads everywhere, other abandoned forms of rainwater harvesting everywhere. So I think what I'm trying to say over here is that while there are many, many different traditional forms of rainwater harvesting, the institutions around how they're maintained, how they're developed, how they're built, basically the governance around them also has to adapt to the changing circumstances and dynamics that we see everywhere. Population growth, migration, changes in economies, changes in livelihoods, all of this stuff. So I think while, yeah, it can be sort of helpful because people have that level of awareness of rainwater harvesting. It's definitely no silver bullet or clear, causal connection. And then finally, of course, there's so many different types of rainwater harvesting. Many scholars have gone into categorizing those different types of rainwater harvesting. And I think what I've really seen in my research is that you have much more, I would say, upgraded forms of rainwater harvesting where the system is really well designed. It's connected to water maximizing technologies such as, for example, drip lines, and is really maintained when there's some level of commercialization of products involved. So when you have farmers growing, say, vegetable crops that they're going to sell, then you have a lot more investment in these rainwater harvesting systems. But then when it's just for subsistence, these rainwater harvesting systems that we see are often just, like a pit dug in the ground, and irrigation done by just buckets. So you really see a range, and it just depends what the ultimate goal is for the household, what that ultimate goal is for their livelihoods. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Radhika. And I'm seeing that we are receiving more and more compliments on and congratulations on your thesis and presentation. So I would like to follow with actually a question from an anonymous attendee, always related to the function and the technology of rainwater harvesting systems. So he's focusing on the meaning of water harvesting that is traditionally thought to be the function of surface storage and use that has slowly got transitioned to rainwater harvesting for groundwater recharge in recent times, at least he says in urban India. What do you think about this change in the meaning globally, especially when rainwater harvesting can either be used for open surface storage or groundwater recharge, depending on underlying geology?
Thanks for this question. I mean, I think, again, it's really interesting to think of the different ways that rainwater harvesting has been used throughout history, and what it is now, and what it almost stands as a symbol for now in terms of the sustainable use of water. So I think India is a fascinating example because on one hand, in cities, rainwater harvesting has really been promoted in many different cities. And that's because cities often see these two twin problems of drought during the dry season and water scarcity, and then flooding during the rainy season. And rainwater harvesting is sort of seen as a way to sort of store that water for use then in the dry seasons. But then in other parts, and in a lot of more rural parts where groundwater is used for irrigation in India, you have a lot of depletion of aquifers. And in those settings, rainwater harvesting is a lot of the time envisioned as to be able to recharge certain points to make boreholes and other wells more functional. I think that while it is often sort of presented as an easy solution, you just kind of use rainwater harvesting to recharge groundwater, I think it's much, much, much more difficult, and it's just not as simple as that. Aquifers are extremely complex. The water you may recharge in one place may not necessarily go to the area where the well has been drilled. You'll also have just major, variations in terms of climatic, land use, sort of environmental changes that doesn't make that clear link between groundwater recharge to necessarily having enough water in a certain area. So I think that, in some ways, there's almost been like, yeah, we can withdraw as much water as we like from the ground as long as we are able to recharge it enough. And I think that link really needs to be approached with a lot more caution. Although, of course, it's something that is absolutely essential to be thinking about when you're drilling a bore well in the first place. Yes. So,
thanks a lot. Thank you so much, Radhika. I would like actually now to ask a question that pertains approaches and practices that are already existing, in particular from Susanna Neto. She's asking whether you got any inspirational insights from Asian practices, for example, from India, and how the different approaches have been changing over time. And she continues that she's asking, while asking this, she also questions the assumption regarding the Global South need to adopt innovation, since in this particular matter, it has been more innovative than the Global North.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe answering the last question first, I think by innovation, what innovation really means is just to do things in a new way to get new results, right? And so I think that everyone is innovative. Global North is super innovative in certain ways. Global South is super innovative in certain ways. But I think that in general, when we're thinking of sustainable development or sustainability transition, there needs to be adoption of innovations, because the flip side of that is that we just continue doing things exactly as we're doing now without any innovation. And that's definitely not going to lead us down a very good path. So yeah, that's what I would say about innovation. Sorry, Katerina, what was the first part of the question?
Yes, so the first part of the question is whether you got any inspirational insights from Asian practices.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's in this literature, it was really interesting to see going in how much of development discourse in sub-Saharan Africa was trying to replicate the Green Revolution in India, in South Asia. And there have been countless papers of authors just, being like, oh, why has the Green Revolution not taken off in sub-Saharan Africa? What is, we need to sort of replicate the success that we see in India to other parts of Africa. And I think that this narrative is so flawed for a couple of reasons. One is that it's while, say both places, there's a lot of course, smallholder irrigation, there's a lot of innovation development, and there are a lot of similarities in some sort of surface level ways. The level of informality, for example, the state's involvement could not be more different. You just have in India a much more a a much more hands-on state when it comes to agriculture. And that just has had massive repercussions for the entire agricultural industry since India's independence. In Kenya, you've had a much more hands-off approach, and in many other sub-Saharan Africa countries, a much more hands-off approach. And so while I think even though the practices may look similar on the surface, I would say the difference in the larger institutional roles of the state really just radically changes the importation of, say, solutions in one place to another place. And I think that now also scholars are really realizing that the way in which irrigation and smallholder irrigation has been carried out in places like India is really, really unsustainable, and is not something that should be replicated in other areas. So yeah, I mean, I know that wasn't exactly your question, but just in my research, I've just seen so many interesting sort of comparisons between South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa around smallholder irrigation development. And I think, breaking down some of those discourse and those superficial similarities is really interesting.
Thanks a lot. And this actually brings me to a question on governance that is asked by Abelardo Rodriguez. He congratulates for the well-organized and interesting presentation. And he mentioned that he has worked in Balochistan in Pakistan in the 90s. He's asking whether you could comment on the governance of rainwater harvesting irrigation in the floodplains and that in the mountainous areas where flood irrigation is practiced. In flood irrigation systems, it continues, the governance is required for faster reaction on how communities will react to the flood intensity and location. He's also asking a second question, whether you could identify the differences between traditional governance versus new wave governance in your study in Kenya. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So yeah, I mean, I think that in terms of sort of flood irrigation versus mountainous irrigation, was that, Katerina?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so. This is also something that comes up a lot in development discourse. So there is a way in which if you are conducting or if you're trying to establish a massive industrialized irrigation system with dams, canals, in your mind, it's this kind of flat land, free-flowing river, canals can nicely be built as a network off of both sides of the river. And I think that this really, really gets called into play when you have smallholder irrigation systems in much more hilly or areas that have just a lot more variations in topography and terrain. And so, I think in those cases, for example, you see farmers who have adopted rainwater harvesting systems use a lot of gravity and use a lot of traditional, say, furrows in order to bring water from one area to another. But when you have really massive, just flat, areas of land, then you usually need a lot of intensive energy pumping to get the water from one place to another. So I think there are sort of differences in the sort of technologies that you would need, the governance that you would need, the sort of institutions that you would need to be able to get water from one place to another, depending on whether it's a flat land or whether it's mountainous. And of course, this has implications for governance. And I think what we see in Kenya, that's interesting in sort of the new wave or the new ways of governing water when it comes to rainwater harvesting, is that you really see a lot of rainwater harvesting in pastoral communities and agro-pastoral communities that I think really subvert these notions of privatizing everything and individualizing everything, because these systems are managed, not just by one household or like a community of households. They're really managed across a larger area, based on mobility patterns, based on relations between trade and exchange networks. And yeah, it's not as much based on the idea that we need to privatize these systems in order to get money out of the products of these systems. So I don't think that necessarily one is better than the other. I would be hesitant of phrasing it like that, but I think that there are definitely just so many ways of these systems are governed. And, like Jempel pointed out, it doesn't make too much sense to have this dichotomy between formal and informal, because a farmer may have formalized certain aspects of their production, but then also have informal aspects of their production as well. But in this sort of spectrum, we see all sorts of governance arrangements, institutional arrangements coming up when it comes to rainwater harvesting systems, all the way from like, the household level, how it's managed within the household, to communities.
Thanks a lot, Radhika. It's very interesting to reflect on the many differences and how they, of course, influence different realities and hear your experience across the different case studies. This actually leads me to a question from Stefan Kimani. He's focusing more on another angle, so actually on the social hydrological perspective of rainwater harvesting. And he's saying, thank you for the wonderful presentation. He is working on the master thesis research that is somehow similar to what you're doing. This focuses on challenges related to the management of community water irrigation ponds in Swaziland, but then with a social hydrological perspective. The question is, among the constraining factors that you have mentioned, to what extent have social technological factors and community perceptions impacted the adoption of rainwater harvesting systems in the study areas? How are the farmers organized around the water systems? For instance, is there some form of organization, water fees, and are there any conflicts around these rainwater harvesting systems? Thanks.
Sure. So I think that this angle, first of all, thanks, Stephen, and feel free to reach out to me on my personal email address if you'd like to talk about this further, if you have any other questions. But I would say that from my perspective, I think that a lot of scholars have concentrated on the social aspect of risk perception in terms of adoption or non-adoption. And I think what we see is that in general, people or households are not necessarily profit maximizing, they're more risk minimizing. So when it comes to deciding on their livelihoods and whether rainwater harvesting will be a component of their livelihood strategy, it's not necessarily about how much that will increase their profits, but it's really more about how much adopting that rainwater harvesting system will minimize the risks that they face in their livelihoods. So I think that's an important perspective to take, because we often see people who are just like, well, if they just did this, then they would get this much money. So why is it that they're not adopting it? And it's just like for any of us, right? There's always an opportunity cost for adopting something. If you're going to adopt something and spend time and money on it, then you're not going to be spending time and money on doing something else that you were doing before. So it's just about weighing those risks for the individual household and farmer. But I would say also definitely pay attention to the larger tendencies that you see, because there's so many aspects that play into risk perception. So for example, is there crop insurance in that area? If there's crop insurance, then maybe farmers are not as risk averse, and then maybe they're more likely to adopt rainwater harvesting systems, for example. So just pay attention to those larger dynamics that are driving perceptions of risk. And that could help explain what some of the root causes behind adoption or not adoption may be. And then when it comes to conflicts and organization, I would say that there are always some level of conflicts when you are managing or trying to sort of govern a common resource together. What really makes the difference, I think, is if there are conflict management sort of institutions and pathways that are recognized and accepted by community members, and a real commitment to resolving those issues. So you can have an amazing setup in place with all of the rules there, but if communities don't feel ownership over those conflict resolution mechanisms, then they're not going to participate in it. So I think what we've seen is when instances in which they are managed successfully, you really see a kind of commitment to those processes, because rainwater harvesting provides something valuable to the community. So whether it's drinking water or for livestock watering, or for crop management, or for channeling floodwaters, it needs to provide something useful to the communities, and that's how they're going to be incentivized to actually, sort of sustain these conflict resolution mechanisms and work on adapting them to new circumstances in the future.
Thanks a lot, Radhika. And yeah, before to move to the two more questions that we have in the chat, I would just like to read you some of the very nice comments that we received. So from Yaki, he's mentioning that, yeah, your presentation was very informative with excellent research outputs. Congratulations. And Shaima is, she's saying that, yeah, thank you for your presentation. It is very productively information for me that is related to my work in my PhD research in water harvesting in Greater Zap River Basin in Kurdistan, Iraq. So you see many colleagues from all over the world working on similar topics. Hamad, wonderful research and presentation. Bernice, good work, Radhika, well explained. Then there's also some clarification from Susanna. She asked the question before on the practices. She was saying that she was referring from India perspective, she meant the rainwater harvesting system, for example, Rajasthan, and not the agroform practices, so more millennial systems. And then, yes, I would like to read you the last two questions, starting with Philly Diableki. Sorry if I misspelled the surname. He's congratulating for the good achievement and asking, at what point can rainwater be considered degraded?
Oh, should I go ahead and answer that one?
Yes, yes, and then I will read you the last one because it's a bit longer, so we can start with this. Thanks.
Yeah, interesting question. I don't think I've received that one before. When can rainwater harvesting be considered degraded? So I think that a lot of it has to do with where the runoff is collected from. So if rainwater harvesting for irrigation is conducted in a manner that I kind of described, like in my case study, where it's collected from a rainwater runoff and then stored in a particular area, then used at a later point of time, you can have all sorts of chemicals and stuff that you don't want in there that are coming in through the runoff. And that can definitely impact the quality of the water that you are using for your crop production and for your, say, vegetable production in particular. So it's very important to sort of be able to assess the content and the water quality. Not only, of course, because of how it ties in with the quality of the crops that you're producing, but then also it can have an impact on the different technologies that you're using. For example, drip lines often get clogged up when the water quality is not good enough, or things like that. But it's also, I think, the level of degradation really matters in terms of what you were trying to use the water for. So, for example, water that is used for certain livestock may be, it could be not fit for human consumption, but it could be fit for livestock consumption. Some people use, with rainwater harvesting, are able to do beekeeping, for example. So maybe the water is okay for that, but it may not be okay for crop production. So I think it really depends on what your end use of the water is, and then being able to assess the quality of water in relation to that. I would say in rural areas, there is a lower risk than in urban areas, where you, of course, have much more pollutants that enter the water. But in rural areas, of course, like chemicals and insecticides and fertilizer runoff are all sort of things that can impact water quality. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good point that I haven't come across that much at all. I haven't really come across any farmers that have done any sort of water quality testing. So if you're planning on doing that research, I would say you should definitely do it. It's very much needed and really important to consider. Thanks.
Thanks, Radhika. And I really like to see how much the discussion is being fed in the Q&A. Abelardo actually adds to this, saying that if the atmosphere is polluted, the quality of rainwater is not good. And this is very relevant issue for large polluted cities in the global south, not water for drinking by humans. And I think we have found a very nice community of rainwater harvesting experts during this seminar. And I think I don't see any more questions apart from one that is actually from Arthur Obare, who also works in Kenya. And unfortunately, I see he's not in the participants anymore. So probably he had to leave already. But it's very nice because he's also providing his contact whether you want to continue the conversation offline. He's saying, thank you for your presentation on rainwater harvesting irrigation and congratulations. I have been working on this topic for my rural home in Ulumbi village. Sorry, I was pushed back. Yeah, in Ulumbi village, Siaya County in Kenya. Hopefully, this will turn out as a rainfall harvesting technologies packaging toolbox in about 3 years. Presently, the concept is in consideration at the Huduma White Box at the Ministry of Information, Communication and Digital Economy of Kenya for implementation approval. Would you advise on how to inject academic angle into the innovation process? And then he's providing his contact, his email, and also specifying that he's carrying out the study as a smallholder farmer himself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fantastic. I mean, yeah, I'm very happy to share my email. Maybe Katerina, you can even just put it in the chat, my personal email address, just to anyone who's interested in reaching out and discussing more about rainwater harvesting. My background is in policy and governance. So I think questions such as these are really interesting to me, just thinking of, okay, now we've, waded through all of this scholarly discourse and a million different analytical frameworks and brought it all together. And then what are the actual implications for policy and governance on the ground? And I would say that in general, there's so much more that the government can do to support rainwater harvesting systems, decentralized systems, because currently what the government is doing in a lot of cases is actively marginalizing them, and in some cases even criminalizing them. So I think in Kenya, so I think that recognition of the role of the government and what it could do better, not even necessarily in terms of pouring a lot of money into some new projects, but really just being a supporting actor to creating a thriving ecosystem, innovation ecosystem around rainwater harvesting technologies. You already see so many farmers just out of their own initiative doing this themselves. And that already demonstrates the extent to which, even in the absence of very supportive governance or very supportive private sector development, in terms of subsidies or taxes, you already see so much adoption. So there's clearly a need, there's clearly a demand, it's clearly super useful. It really has an opportunity to be a sustainable form of irrigation and irrigation expansion going forward. So yeah, I'd be happy to discuss more on the policy implications for anyone who's interested. So please feel free to reach out to me. And yeah, it was fantastic having this really great discussion, and just great hearing all of those different questions and engagement. I think often you can just feel very, with your blinders on as you do PhD research. So this has been fantastic, and thank you so much. And thanks so much, Katerina, for moderating and managing all of this.
Thank you so much, Radhika. And actually, perhaps we still have time for one very last question that came in as the final one. I promise it's the last one, because I think it's a very interesting one, and it's also from another side of the world, so across the sea, and is from Argentina. So Juan Pablo Zamora Gomez is asking, so saying thank you for your excellent presentation. In Argentina, rainwater harvesting systems are widely implemented in arid regions of the Chaco Plain. Would you comment on some recommendations related with legal frameworks in order to enhance state performance for rainwater harvesting systems promotion? Perhaps this is also a long question, so in case you also want to respond later or continue the conversation via email, Juan, you can also reach out to Radhika.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I just really don't know much about the specific context of Argentina or what these rainwater harvesting, systems in these arid regions are for. But I think in terms of the legislation around it, I think in all of the countries where we see rainwater harvesting systems that are used by communities or are not privately or individually owned, you always have issues of access, you always have issues of rights. So I think that, legal systems and legislation should really try to protect the most vulnerable livelihoods that depend on these rainwater harvesting systems, and really just help support and ensure their right to access these systems. As Jampel had mentioned, you don't always need to privatize things to ensure that that people have certain rights to them. So I think probably legal systems around the world, not just in Argentina, could really think a little bit better about how to ensure that these systems are supported, maintained, encouraged, developed, without necessarily being individualized, being privatized or commercialized. So yeah, I hope that's a helpful ending point.
Thanks so much. It was a very nice comment to end. And thank you, Radhika, again, for your availability and the extensive insights that you've provided us today during the seminar. Before we close, I would just like to say some final words on the upcoming seminars that we have. So as you might have seen from also the latest newsletter that we had, the next, the seminar that was planned for 2 weeks from now has been postponed, and actually now is planned at the end of the series, now ending on the 11th of December with Paulina. So the next session will actually be on the 22nd of May with Gina Gilson on informal markets. And this session will start a bit later than the usual time because it will be hosted from California. So we will start at 4 p.m. In Amsterdam or Central European Summertime. And you will find, of course, more detail in the upcoming weeks coming to our website. And I also want to remind you of the next seminar that we have today, actually starting at 4 p.m. From Professor Beatriz Rodriguez Labajos in what we learned about environmental justice, looking at water in mining conflicts. And this is a webinar hosted by the Amsterdam Sustainability Institute, Water Security and Justice Clusters, together with NEWAVE and Water Space. I also want to take the opportunity to thank once again all our partners and host institution of NEWAVE